Look, when they told me studying abroad would be a life-changing experience, I figured they meant learning new languages, or maybe discovering I actually like fermented fish paste. I didn't expect to become the star of what basically amounts to intergalactic gladiator combat, because I knocked over a fancy paperweight. But here we are. My name is Zara Kowalski, and I'm what you might generously call an exchange student on the lovely world of Vexthara. I say generously because most exchange students don't end up sentenced to death by combat before lunch on their third day. Then again, most exchange students probably don't carry engineering textbooks in backpacks that weigh more than a small moon. The trouble started when I walked into Chancellor Grex's office to discuss my course schedule. Now, Chancellor Grex is what happens when you take a iguana, feed it nothing but protein powder and self-importance for about 50 years, then give it a PhD in bureaucratic pompousness. He's got scales that shimmer green gold, eyes that look like they're constantly calculating your net worth, and the kind of voice that makes you want to check your pockets to make sure he hasn't somehow charged you for breathing his air. His office is decorated like a museum dedicated to his own magnificence. Awards, certificates, and what I can only assume are the stuffed heads of students who ask too many questions line the walls. But the centerpiece, the crown jewel of his ego shrine, sits right there on his desk. A crystal formation about the size of a basketball, glowing with this soft blue light that probably costs more than my entire college tuition. The crystal and memory of ancestral wisdom, he calls it. Sacred relic of the Vextharan people. Priceless artifact of cultural significance. You know, the kind of thing you really shouldn't knock over with your backpack when you turn around too quickly after being told your xenobiology credits won't transfer. But physics, as I learned in Professor Martinez's class back on Earth, is a harsh mistress. Angular momentum plus gravitational acceleration plus 1 over stuffed backpack equals one very expensive mistake. The crystal hit the floor with a sound like wind chimes having an existential crisis. Chancellor Grex stared at the scattered pieces of his precious relic, then at me, then back at the pieces. His scales shifted from green to a color I can only describe as furious purple. When he spoke, his voice had dropped about 3 octaves into what I'm pretty sure was the Vextharan equivalent of caps lock. You have desecrated the most sacred artifact of our civilization. I have excellent insurance, I offered helpfully. Apparently that was the wrong thing to say. The penalty for such an act of vandalism, he continued, ignoring my very reasonable suggestion, is trial by combat in the Apex arena. Now, I should mention that I'd heard whispers about the Apex arena during my very brief time on campus. It's basically where they send beings who've committed crimes so terrible that regular prison seems too merciful. Think Roman Colosseum, but with more tentacles and significantly worse Wi-Fi. The survival rate, according to campus gossip, hovers somewhere around the same odds as winning the lottery while being struck by lightning during a solar eclipse. Isn't that a bit extreme for an accident? I asked, still staring at the crystal fragments and wondering if superglue worked on sacred relics. Chancellor Grex leaned back in his chair, and I swear I could see him trying not to smile. The arena will teach you the value of respecting superior civilizations. Perhaps 5 minutes of terror will help you appreciate the gravity of your actions before your inevitable demise. And that's how I found myself being escorted by 2 guards who looked like they'd been carved out of granite and bad attitudes toward what was essentially my execution. As we walked through the corridors, I couldn't help but notice that Chancellor Grex was following at a distance, probably wanting to watch the show. The thing is, he kept using that word. Superior civilization, superior culture, superior species. And honestly, for a superior civilization, they sure seem to have a lot of rules about not breaking their stuff accidentally. But then again, I suppose every civilization thinks they're superior until some engineering student with a heavy backpack comes along and proves that the laws of physics don't really care about your cultural superiority. The Apex Arena turned out to be exactly as charming as advertised. Imagine if someone took a football stadium, decorated it with the aesthetic sensibilities of a haunted house, and then added enough weapons to supply a small war. The stands were packed with what I can only assume were very bored aliens looking for some afternoon entertainment that didn't involve reruns of galactic Real Housewives. At the center of this delightful venue stood a figure that could only be the announcer. Vox Boomhart had clearly missed his calling as a carnival barker on some distant world where volume equals credibility. He stood about 7 feet tall, with skin that shifted through colors like a mood ring having a seizure, and a voice that could probably be heard from orbit. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary entities, Vox boomed, his voice echoing off the arena walls. Welcome to today's educational demonstration of why you should never ever mess with sacred crystals. The crowd cheered. Apparently, public executions were considered prime entertainment around here. I made a mental note to write a strongly worded review on their tourism website, assuming I lived long enough to figure out their Wi-Fi password. In the red corner, Vox continued, gesturing toward a gate that looked like it had been designed by someone with serious anger management issues. "We have our returning champion, Crag the Destroyer." Crag emerged from the gate, and I immediately understood why he'd earned that particular nickname. He stood roughly the size of a small building, with muscles on top of muscles and what appeared to be natural armor plating covering most of his body. His species looked like what would happen if a rhinoceros decided to hit the gym seriously for about a decade. He carried a weapon that was less sword and more architectural feature. "Crag has won 47 consecutive battles," Vox announced proudly, "and has never once required medical attention afterward." The crowd went wild. Crag flexed, which caused several small earthquakes in the immediate area. And in the blue corner, Vox continued, his voice taking on a tone that suggested he was about to announce something particularly amusing. "We have Slythex the Silent Death." Slythex slithered out of another gate, and I realized that my day was just getting better and better. Imagine a snake, but give it arms, opposable thumbs, and what appeared to be a PhD in unpleasant ways to kill people. Her scales were a lovely shade of purple that probably indicated some form of toxicity, and her eyes had that special quality that suggested she was calculating exactly how many ways she could end your life before you finished your next sentence. "Slythex has eliminated 32 opponents using 17 different types of venom," Vox explained cheerfully, "including some that our medical team is still trying to identify." 2 more gates opened, revealing what I can only describe as the supporting cast of my impending doom. There was something that looked like a cross between a bear and a food processor, another creature that appeared to be made entirely of angry crystal formations, and what might have been a perfectly normal humanoid, if you ignored the fact that it had way too many teeth and eyes that glowed like dying stars. And finally, Vox said, his voice now dripping with the kind of amusement you usually hear from people watching fail videos. "In the pink corner, we have our special guest, a human." He said human the way you might say intestinal parasite. The crowd responded with a mixture of laughter, and what I can only assume were the Vextheran equivalent of catcalls. "This soft fleshy creature has no natural weapons, no armor, no venom, and no apparent survival instincts." Vox continued. "Current odds of survival are being calculated, but early estimates suggest we might need to invent new ways to express numbers that small." I looked around at my fellow gladiators, who were all staring at me with expressions ranging from pity to hunger. Crag actually looked apologetic, which was oddly touching coming from someone who could probably bench press a spaceship. "The rules are simple," Vox announced. "Last being standing wins their freedom. Everyone else becomes nutritional supplements for our victory garden." Slythex hissed something that might have been a comment about how I'd probably taste bland. The crystal creature made sounds like wind chimes in a hurricane. Crag just nodded respectfully, which I appreciated. "Does anyone have snacks?" I asked the group, because I'm thinking this might take a while, and I get cranky when my blood sugar drops. They all stared at me like I'd just asked if anyone wanted to discuss their feelings, which honestly might have been less weird than asking about snacks right before a fight to the death. But here's the thing about being an engineering student. You learn to look at problems differently. While everyone else was sizing each other up for combat effectiveness, I was studying the arena itself. The layout, the materials, the structural supports, the environmental systems, because sometimes the best way to win a game is to change the rules. The horn sounded, which apparently meant it was time for everyone to try killing each other. I'd like to say I had some brilliant tactical plan ready to go, but honestly my strategy was pretty much duck and cover until I figured out what the heck I was doing. While Crag charged straight at the crystal creature with all the subtlety of a freight train, and Slythex immediately started looking for shadows to disappear into, I did what any sensible engineering student would do. I ran like my life depended on it, which coincidentally it did. The arena floor was littered with debris from previous fights. Broken weapons, chunks of stone, what looked like the remains of some very unfortunate furniture, and interestingly enough, several pieces of the arena's own infrastructure that had been damaged over time. To most people this would look like junk. To someone who'd spent 4 years learning how to build things, it looked like a hardware store having a clearance sale. "The human appears to be employing the coward's gambit," Vox announced to the crowd, his voice carrying that special tone of disappointment usually reserved for sports commentators watching a team lose by 30 points. "A bold strategy, let's see how it works out for her." I dove behind a chunk of what used to be a wall just as something very sharp whistled past my head. Slythex had apparently decided I looked like an easy target, which was both insulting and probably accurate. She was slithering toward my hiding spot with the kind of predatory grace that suggested she'd done this many times before. "Here, soft thing," she hissed, her voice like silk wrapped around a razor blade. "I promise it will only hurt for a moment." "That's very considerate of you," I called back, frantically rummaging through the debris pile, "but I'm going to have to pass on your generous offer." My hands closed around something interesting. A piece of twisted metal that looked like it had once been part of the arena's artificial gravity system. Most people would see scrap metal. I saw the core component of a makeshift slingshot, especially when combined with the elastic ceiling strips I'd spotted from what used to be the environmental controls. Slythex rounded the corner just as I finished my impromptu engineering project. She reared back, probably preparing to introduce me to one of her 17 different venoms, when I let loose with my gravitational assist slingshot. The chunk of arena flooring I'd selected as ammunition caught her right in what I hoped was a non-vital area. The impact sent her flying backward into one of the arena's gravity wells, which are apparently a feature they installed for dramatic effect. She hit the distortion field and promptly found herself stuck in a localized area where down was suddenly sideways. Fascinating, Vox commented, sounding genuinely surprised for the first time. The human has somehow managed to weaponize basic physics. Our sports medicine team is examining the replay to determine if this constitutes cheating or innovation. While Slythex was busy figuring out which way was up, I noticed that the bear food processor hybrid had decided I looked like his next meal. He came lumbering toward me with the kind of determined hunger that suggested he hadn't eaten in a while and thought I'd make a nice snack. This time I had a different approach in mind. See, the arena's environmental system was designed to maintain optimal viewing conditions, which meant they had atmospheric processors running constantly. And atmospheric processors, as any engineering student knows, create pressure differentials. I grabbed a piece of debris and used it to wedge open one of the maintenance panels I'd spotted earlier. The resulting pressure blast caught food processor bear right in the face, spinning him around and sending him stumbling directly into the path of Crag, who was having his own problems with the crystal creature. The collision was spectacular. Food processor bear bounced off Crag like a tennis ball hitting a brick wall, then ricocheted into the arena's far wall where he hit with a sound like a demolition project gone wrong. He slid down the wall and didn't get back up. I'm starting to think our human contestant might have some engineering background, Vox announced, his voice now carrying a note of genuine interest. Either that or she's the luckiest being in the known galaxy. The creature made of angry crystal formations had apparently decided that I was becoming a problem. It made those wind chime sounds again, but louder and more urgent, then started moving toward me with the kind of purposeful intent that suggested it had figured out I was responsible for the recent chaos. Now, crystal creatures are interesting from a materials science perspective. They're incredibly hard, nearly impossible to damage with conventional weapons, and they conduct energy really well. Which is why I spent the next 30 seconds leading it on a merry chase around the arena until I could position it exactly where I wanted it. The arena's lighting system, like most advanced installations, used high-energy plasma conduits. And plasma conduits, when they come into contact with highly conductive crystal formations, create what we in the engineering business call a really spectacular light show. I kicked the damaged conduit I'd been working on just as Crystal Creature stepped on it. The resulting electrical discharge lit up the arena like a 4th of July celebration, and when the light faded, all that was left of my crystalline opponent was a pile of very pretty, very inert mineral samples. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vox announced, his voice now carrying what sounded suspiciously like professional respect, "I believe we may need to revise our initial assessment of human capabilities." The remaining two creatures, who had been watching this display with growing alarm, looked at each other, then at me, then at the various pieces of arena infrastructure I was now examining with obvious interest. One of them, the one with too many teeth, made a sound that might have been a whimper. "You know what," he said in surprisingly good galactic standard, "I think I hear my mother calling." And with that, he and his companion both raised their hands in what I recognized as the universal gesture for surrender. "Well," I said, brushing dust off my hands and looking around at the suddenly quiet arena, "that was educational." The arena had gone from chaos to an oddly tense silence. Crag the Destroyer stood in the center of the battlefield, his massive form casting a shadow that could probably eclipse a small moon. Around him lay the evidence of what happens when an unstoppable force meets several very movable objects, none of which had fared particularly well in the encounter. He looked at me with what I can only describe as professional curiosity, like a master craftsman examining a particularly unusual tool. Then he looked at the surrendering creatures, the unconscious food processor bear, the pile of crystal dust, and Slythex, who was still trying to figure out how gravity worked in her current predicament. "You are not what I expected," Crag said, his voice carrying the kind of rumble that suggested his vocal cords were probably classified as seismic equipment. "I get that a lot," I replied, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "Usually it's my professors saying it right before they fail me though." Crag hefted his massive sword, which looked like it had been forged by someone who thought subtlety was a type of mineral. "I have fought warriors from every corner of the galaxy. Champions who could level mountains, assassins who could kill with a whisper, creatures that existed only to destroy. You are none of these things. Nope, I agreed cheerfully, backing away slowly while my eyes scanned the arena for anything useful that I hadn't already weaponized. I'm just a really dedicated student with a talent for breaking expensive things. Yet you have defeated them all. Crag began walking toward me with the kind of measured pace that suggested he was in no hurry. After all, where was I going to go? How? Well, I said, dodging to the left as his sword carved a groove in the arena floor that would probably require professional repair. I had a really good physics professor. Professor Martinez always said that if you understand the forces at work, you can make anything into a weapon. Crag swung again, and I rolled behind another piece of debris. His blade sheared through the chunk of stone like it was made of butter, but the important thing was that it bought me a few seconds to think. Unfortunately, thinking while someone the size of a building tries to turn you into human confetti is surprisingly difficult. You fight like a coward, Crag observed, though his tone suggested this was more of a professional assessment than an insult. I prefer to think of it as fighting like an engineer, I said, scrambling over a pile of rubble. We're all about efficiency and minimal resource expenditure. The truth was, I was running out of environmental hazards to exploit. I'd used the gravity wells, the pressure systems, and the electrical conduits. Crag was too experienced to fall for the same tricks that had worked on the others, and too smart to let me lead him into an obvious trap. But here's something they don't teach you in conventional warfare 101. Sometimes the best weapon isn't a weapon at all, sometimes it's information. So Crag, I said, ducking under another swing that would have split me in half, 47 consecutive wins. That's impressive. How long have you been stuck in this place? Stuck. Crag paused mid-swing, looking genuinely confused. I am not stuck. I am the champion. Right. But when was the last time you saw your family, your friends, anyone who wasn't trying to kill you or watching you kill other people? For just a moment, something flickered across Crag's face. It was subtle, but I'd spent enough time around homesick students to recognize the expression. It was the look of someone who'd been away from home for way too long. I have no family, he said, but his voice carried just a hint of uncertainty. Everyone has family, I said, continuing to circle him while keeping my voice conversational. Maybe not blood family, but someone who cares whether you come home safe. Someone who worries about you. Someone who's probably wondering where the hell you've been for however long you've been playing gladiator. Crag's grip on his sword shifted slightly. The arena is my home now. No, it's not, I said firmly. The arena is a cage, a really big, really fancy cage with premium seating and overpriced concessions, but still a cage. And you know what the worst part is? You're so good at being in the cage that they'll never let you out. I am the champion. He repeated, but now it sounded less like a boast, and more like something he was trying to convince himself of. You're a prisoner with a good performance record, I corrected. And every time you win, every time you give them a good show, you're just proving that they were right to put you here. While I'd been talking, I'd been working my way toward one of the structural support columns that held up the arena's upper levels. These columns were designed to bear enormous weight, but they were also designed with a very specific load distribution in mind. Change that distribution suddenly, and even the strongest structure becomes vulnerable. The thing is, Crag, I continued, reaching into my backpack for something I'd been saving. I've been studying this arena since I got here. Not just the weapons and the environmental systems, but the architecture, the engineering, the physics of how this whole place works. I pulled out my tablet, the same one I'd been using to take notes in my structural engineering class. The screen showed a detailed analysis I'd been working on during the fight, mapping stress points and load-bearing calculations for the arena's construction. See this column? I pointed to the massive pillar beside us. It's holding up about 60% of the upper deck's weight, but there's a fundamental design flaw in the base structure, a single point of failure that could bring down this entire section if someone knew exactly where to apply pressure. Crag looked at the column, then at my tablet, then at me. You would bring down the arena. Just this section, I said, enough to create a localized collapse that would trap us both without killing us. A draw, essentially. No winner, no loser, just two people stuck in a rubble pile until the rescue crews dig us out. And then we both get medical attention, instead of one of us becoming fertilizer. I said, look, I don't want to hurt you, Crag. You seem like a decent guy who got dealt a really bad hand, but I'm not going to die just because Chancellor Grex thinks humans are weak. Crag stared at the column for a long moment, then at his sword, then at me. You would risk your own life to save mine, I'd risk both our lives to save both our lives, I corrected. It's a calculated risk based on structural engineering principles and the assumption that their rescue protocols are reasonably competent. And if you are wrong, then we'll both be very briefly disappointed, I admitted. But honestly, I like those odds better than the alternative. Crag was quiet for several seconds, his massive form perfectly still. The crowd, which had been cheering and jeering throughout the fight, had gone silent. Even Vox seemed to be holding his breath. Finally, Crag lowered his sword. You are either the bravest or the most foolish being I have ever encountered. Why not both? I asked. I'm a student. We specialize in brave stupidity. Very well, Crag said, stepping back. Show me this structural weakness you have discovered. I walked over to the column's base, where a series of support braces formed a complex geometric pattern. According to my calculations, if you remove just the right brace at just the right angle, the entire load would shift to a single point that wasn't designed to handle that much stress. Right here, I said, pointing to a specific bracket. One good hit with something heavy, and basic physics does the rest. Crag examined the spot I'd indicated, his experienced eye immediately seeing what I'd calculated. He nodded slowly. You are correct. This would indeed cause a controlled collapse. So, I said, do we do this the easy way, or do I have to improvise another physics lesson? Crag looked at his sword, then at the column, then at me. Then, to my complete surprise, he started laughing. It was a deep rumbling sound that seemed to come from somewhere around his boots. 47 victories, he said, still chuckling, and I am finally defeated by someone who does not even try to fight me. He raised his sword high above his head, and for a moment I thought I'd miscalculated everything. Then he brought it down, not on me, but on the structural brace I'd identified. The arena shuddered, metal screamed, and somewhere in the upper deck, Chancellor Grex probably realized that his simple lesson in humility had gone catastrophically wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, Vox announced, his voice carrying a note of panic that suggested this was not part of the scheduled programming. We appear to be experiencing some technical difficulties. The column groaned, shifted, and began its carefully calculated descent toward the arena floor. Crag and I looked at each other, then at the approaching ceiling. For the record, I said as we both dove for the most structurally sound piece of cover we could find, this seemed like a much better idea when it was just theoretical. You know what they don't tell you about controlled demolitions? The controlled part is really more of a suggestion than a guarantee. What I had calculated as a neat, localized collapse turned into something that sounded like the galaxy's angriest percussion section having a breakdown in a hardware store. When the dust finally settled, Crag and I found ourselves in what could generously be called a bunker and more accurately described as a pile of expensive rubble with pretensions. We were alive, which was definitely a win, but we were also thoroughly trapped under about 6 tons of premium arena architecture. Well, Crag said, brushing concrete dust out of his scales, this is cozy. I may have slightly underestimated the cascade effect, I admitted, examining the debris pattern around us. On the bright side, my structural engineering professor would probably give me extra credit for this. Above us, muffled by several layers of collapsed seating, we could hear the sounds of what I can only assume was the most chaotic evacuation in Vextheran entertainment history. Vox's voice, considerably less booming than usual, was trying to maintain some semblance of professional commentary while clearly having no idea what was happening. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice filtered down through the rubble, we are experiencing an unprecedented situation. Our gladiatorial combat has apparently evolved into an impromptu engineering demonstration. Please remain calm while our emergency response teams attempt to understand what the hell just happened. Should we call out? Crag asked. Let them know we are alive. In a minute, I said, pulling out my tablet again and starting to document everything with the kind of thorough detail that would make my professors weep with pride. First, I need to get this all recorded for my thesis. See, while everyone else had been focused on the spectacle of the arena combat, I'd been conducting what was essentially a field study in comparative xenosociology, structural engineering, and crisis management. The entire experience was a goldmine of research data that would probably keep me busy writing papers for the next 3 years. Your thesis? Crag asked, looking genuinely curious despite our current situation. Comparative xenosociology with a focus on conflict resolution through applied engineering, I explained, taking photos of the debris pattern around us. The working title is Why Hitting Things with Other Things is Less Effective Than Understanding Why Things Hit Back. That is a terrible title, Crag observed. Yeah, I'm still workshopping it, I admitted. But the research is solid. Look at what just happened here. Chancellor Grex thought he could teach me a lesson about respecting superior civilizations by throwing me into a death trap. Instead, he created a perfect laboratory environment for testing human problem-solving approaches under extreme stress. I showed Crag my tablet, which now displayed a comprehensive analysis of everything that had occurred in the arena. Combat effectiveness statistics, resource utilization charts, environmental factor assessments, and a detailed timeline of how each encounter had been resolved. You documented all of this during the fights? Crag asked, scrolling through the data with the kind of fascination usually reserved for people discovering fire. Multitasking is a valuable skill, I said. Plus, my academic advisor always says that the best research happens when you're too busy surviving to overthink the methodology. The sound of drilling equipment began filtering down from above, accompanied by voices shouting instructions in several different languages. The rescue operation was apparently underway, which meant we probably had about 20 minutes before they dug us out, and I had to deal with the aftermath of what I was starting to realize was a fairly significant diplomatic incident. Crag, I said, making a decision that would probably either get me a commendation or get me expelled, how would you feel about helping me turn this whole disaster into something positive? I am listening, he said, which I took as a good sign. Well, according to my research, this entire arena system is fundamentally flawed from both an ethical and practical standpoint. You've got intelligent beings forced to fight for entertainment, a legal system that uses combat as punishment, and a social structure that equates might with right. It's like someone took the worst parts of a dozen different civilizations and mashed them together. This is true, Crag agreed. But it is also how things have always been done. That's the beautiful thing about being a student, I said, grinning despite our current circumstances. We specialize in proving that just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. I pulled up another section of my tablet, showing the detailed cultural analysis I'd been working on. Look at this data. The arena system doesn't actually reduce crime or teach respect for authority. It just creates a cycle where violence is the default solution to social problems. But what if instead of fighting to the death, people had to solve collaborative engineering challenges? What if conflict resolution involved actually resolving conflicts instead of just eliminating one of the parties involved? Crag stared at the screen for several seconds, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You want to reform the entire judicial system of Vexthera. I want to write a really impressive thesis, I corrected. Reforming the judicial system is just a side effect. The drilling sounds were getting louder, and I could hear Chancellor Grex's voice among the rescue team voices, though I couldn't make out what he was saying through the debris. Probably something about how this was all my fault, which was technically accurate but missed the larger point about systemic issues and institutional reform. There is something you should know, Crag said suddenly. I was not always a gladiator. I was an engineer, he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been nostalgia. Structural engineering, specifically. I designed buildings, bridges, space stations. Then I made a mistake on a load-bearing calculation that caused a minor collapse. No one was seriously injured, but the legal system decided that trial by combat was appropriate justice. I stared at him. You're an engineer, was an engineer, he corrected. Now I am a gladiator, who happens to remember engineering principles. That's how you knew I was right about the column, I realized. That's how I knew your calculations were not only correct but elegant, Crag said. You identified a structural weakness that I had noticed but never thought to exploit. It was brilliant work. Want to help me write a paper about it? I asked. I could use a co-author who actually knows what he's talking about. Crag was quiet for a moment, then he smiled, which on someone his size was like watching a mountain develop a sense of humor. I have not written an engineering paper in 7 years. Perfect, I said. I've never written one that involved controlled demolitions and gladiatorial combat. We can learn together. The drilling stopped, and we could hear voices getting closer. Bright lights began filtering down through cracks in the debris, and someone was shouting instructions about stabilizing the remaining structure before attempting extraction. Miss Kowalski, came Chancellor Grex's voice, muffled but clearly carrying a tone of barely controlled panic. Are you alive down there? Define alive, I called back. If you mean breathing and conscious, then yes. If you mean ready to write a detailed report about systemic failures in your judicial system, then also yes. There was a pause that suggested Chancellor Grex was having the kind of day that administrators have nightmares about. We are initiating extraction procedures, he called down. Please remain calm and do not attempt to move any of the debris. Don't worry, I called back. We're using the time productively. Crag and I are discussing collaborative research opportunities and institutional reform initiatives. Another pause, longer this time. Who is Crag? Chancellor Grex asked, his voice carrying the kind of dread usually reserved for people receiving tax audits. Your former gladiatorial champion, I explained cheerfully. Turns out he's actually a structural engineer who got railroaded by your legal system. We're going to write a paper about it. The silence from above stretched long enough that I started to wonder if Chancellor Grex had fainted. Finally his voice returned, sounding like he was speaking through gritted teeth. Miss Kowalski, when we extract you from this situation, we are going to have a very long discussion about appropriate behavior for exchange students. Looking forward to it, I said. I've prepared a presentation. Cragg looked at me with something that might have been admiration. You are either going to revolutionize interspecies education, or get us both expelled from the galaxy. Why not both? I asked. I'm on a roll. 6 months later, I stood in the grand academic amphitheater of the Galactic University Consortium, looking out at an audience that included some of the most distinguished scholars, diplomats, and policymakers in known space. My thesis defense had drawn quite a crowd, which probably had something to do with the fact that my research had accidentally triggered the largest judicial reform movement in Vextheran history. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary entities, I began, borrowing Vox's opening line because it had grown on me. Thank you for attending my thesis defense on collaborative problem-solving versus traditional combat resolution, a comparative analysis of conflict management systems with practical applications in interspecies diplomacy. I'd finally settled on a title that sounded appropriately academic while still capturing the essence of what had happened. My advisor had suggested I tone down some of the more colorful language in the original draft, particularly the section where I described Chancellor Grex's judicial philosophy as weaponized stupidity wrapped in bureaucratic pretension. As you can see from the data presented in Chapter 3, I continued, clicking to a slide that showed before and after statistics from the Vextheran legal system. Implementing collaborative problem-solving approaches resulted in a 73% reduction in repeat offenses, an 89% increase in successful conflict resolution, and a 100% decrease in accidental demolitions of public entertainment venues. There was polite laughter from the audience, though I noticed several Vextheran officials in the front row looking like they were still processing the implications of having their entire legal system overhauled by someone who wasn't even supposed to be there permanently. The key insight, I explained, was recognizing that most conflicts arise from systemic misunderstandings rather than fundamental incompatibilities. When beings are forced to work together to solve complex problems, they tend to discover that their perceived enemies are actually potential collaborators with complementary skill sets. In the third row, Cragg nodded approvingly. He'd cleaned up nicely for the occasion, trading his gladiator gear for the kind of professional attire that made him look like what he'd always been under all that arena nonsense, a brilliant engineer who'd gotten dealt a bad hand by a broken system. My co-author, Dr. Cragg Stonehammer, I said, gesturing toward him, has been instrumental in developing the practical applications outlined in Chapter 5. His expertise in structural engineering, combined with his unique perspective on institutional reform, has helped us create a framework that's already being implemented across 17 different star systems. Dr. Cragg. That had a nice ring to it. After our extraction from the arena ruins, it had taken about 3 weeks of paperwork and academic review to get his engineering credentials restored and his criminal record expunged. Turns out, when you can prove that someone's conviction was based on a fundamentally flawed understanding of how justice should work, the appeals process moves pretty quickly. The Vextherana Collaborative Justice Initiative, I continued, has transformed their former Apex Arena into the Galactic Center for Conflict Resolution and Applied Engineering. What was once a venue for ritualized violence is now a research facility where beings from across the galaxy come to solve problems together instead of trying to eliminate each other. Chancellor Grex, sitting in the front row and looking like someone who'd aged about 10 years and 6 months, raised his hand. I'd been expecting this. Yes, Chancellor. Miss Kowalski, he said, his voice carrying the kind of resignation usually reserved for people who've given up fighting the inevitable. While I acknowledge that your research has produced measurable improvements in our judicial system, I feel compelled to point out that your methodology was highly irregular and potentially dangerous. You're absolutely right, I agreed cheerfully. Traditional academic research doesn't usually involve gladiatorial combat or controlled demolitions, but then again, traditional academic research doesn't usually produce the kind of real-world impact we've achieved here. I clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline of reforms that had spread from Vexthera to neighboring systems. The collaborative justice model is now being studied by the Galactic Legal Reform Council, the Interspecies Diplomatic Corps, and the Universal Engineering Ethics Board. 3 different species that were on the brink of war last month are now working together to build a joint research station. And best of all, gladiatorial combat as a form of legal punishment has been officially classified as a violation of fundamental sentient rights in 47 different jurisdictions. The audience murmured appreciatively. Academic types love it when research has practical applications, especially when those applications involve making the galaxy a slightly less violent place. Furthermore, I continued, warming to my theme, the economic impact has been substantial. The former arena now employs twice as many beings as it did before, generates 17 times more revenue through research partnerships and educational programs, and has a workplace satisfaction rating that's literally off the charts because we had to invent new metrics to measure how much people enjoy solving problems instead of trying to kill each other. Vox Boomhart, who'd somehow managed to reinvent himself as a science communicator and was now the official spokesperson for the Collaborative Justice Initiative, gave me an enthusiastic thumbs up from the back of the room. He'd discovered that explaining complex engineering solutions to diverse audiences was actually more exciting than announcing fights to the death, especially since it came with better job security and significantly fewer insurance liability issues. The most significant finding, I said, advancing to my conclusion slides, is that intelligence and creativity are far more effective tools for conflict resolution than strength and intimidation. When beings are encouraged to use their minds instead of their weapons, they consistently develop solutions that benefit everyone involved rather than just eliminating perceived threats. I paused, looking out at the audience of academics, officials and reformed gladiators who'd gathered to hear about how accidentally breaking a sacred crystal had somehow led to the largest diplomatic breakthrough in recent galactic history. In closing, I said, I'd like to thank Chancellor Grex for providing such a comprehensive real-world laboratory for testing these theories, even if that wasn't his original intention. I'd like to thank Dr. Cragg for proving that the best research partnerships can develop under the most unexpected circumstances. And I'd like to thank the Galactic University Consortium for recognizing that sometimes the most important discoveries happen when students get in way over their heads and have to engineer their way out. The applause was enthusiastic and lasted long enough that I started to wonder if I should have prepared an encore presentation. When it finally died down, the head of my thesis committee, Professor Valdez, stood up with the kind of smile that suggested I'd probably passed my defense. Miss Kowalski, she said, on behalf of the committee, I'm pleased to inform you that your thesis has been approved with highest honors. Furthermore, we'd like to offer you a position as Associate Professor of Applied Interspecies Engineering, with a joint appointment in the Department of Diplomatic Innovation. Professor Kowalski, I said, testing how it sounded. I like it. There is one condition, Professor Valdez continued, her smile taking on a slightly wicked edge. Your first assignment will be developing a standardized curriculum for teaching collaborative problem solving to other species. We've received requests from 43 different star systems asking for training programs based on your research. I looked out at the audience, at Chancellor Grex who was shaking his head in what might have been bewilderment or admiration, at Dr. Cragg who was already pulling out his tablet to start taking notes, at Vox who was probably composing press releases in his head, and at all the other beings who'd somehow become part of this accidentally revolutionary approach to making the galaxy work better. Well, I said, grinning at the enormity of what we'd somehow accomplished, I suppose I should start by developing a course called How to Not Accidentally Overthrow Legal Systems While Studying Abroad. That, said Professor Valdez, sounds like exactly the kind of class this galaxy needs. Later, at the celebration reception, I found myself standing with Cragg on a balcony overlooking the university campus. Below us, students from dozens of different species were working together on projects that would have been impossible before someone decided that collaboration might be more effective than combat. Do you ever regret it? I asked him, giving up the gladiator life for academia. Cragg considered this seriously, the way engineers consider all questions involving structural integrity and long-term consequences. I have not been shot at, stabbed, poisoned, or electrocuted in 6 months, he said finally. My mother has started speaking to me again, and yesterday, a paper I co-authored was cited in the Galactic Engineering Journal. So no, I do not regret it. Plus, I added, the dental plan is probably better. The dental plan is definitely better, Cragg agreed. Though I do miss the dramatic entrances. Don't worry, I said, pulling out my tablet to show him the preliminary course schedules I'd been working on. Something tells me that teaching collaborative problem solving to 43 different species is going to provide plenty of opportunities for dramatic problem solving. Cragg looked at the schedule, which included courses like Advanced Diplomatic Engineering, Structural Analysis for Conflict Resolution, and How to Build Bridges Instead of Burning Them, a practical approach to interspecies cooperation. Professor Kowalski, he said, I believe we are going to revolutionize education. Dr. Cragg, I replied, I think we already have. And as the sun set over the campus of the Galactic University Consortium, casting long shadows across the courtyards where beings from across the galaxy were learning to solve problems together instead of fighting about them, I couldn't help but think that sometimes the best way to study abroad is to accidentally break something important and then spend the next 6 months figuring out how to build something better in its place. My mother always said I had a talent for turning disasters into opportunities. She just probably never expected those opportunities to involve reforming intergalactic legal systems and accidentally becoming a professor before I'd even finished being a student. But then again, that's the thing about engineering. You learn to work with the materials you have, adapt to unexpected circumstances, and always remember that the most elegant solutions usually come from understanding the problem better than anyone thought possible, even if the problem involves accidentally overthrowing several centuries of established legal precedent because you knocked over a really expensive paperweight with your backpack.